Dear friends, welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware, and I'm also the Khan of Khanversations. I'm delighted today to have with me Professor John Esposito, who is the Dean of Islamic Studies worldwide. He's probably the most prominent scholar of Islam in the Western Academy as well as in the Muslim world. He is known for talking about essentially making the case for Islam and democracy more than 20 years ago. He has also examined how the geopolitics of the West has shaped and reshaped the understanding of Islam in the West. He has taken over from Edward Said, whose famous book Orientalism exposed the bias against the Orient, against Islam, against Eastern societies, and then moved forward to argue that if Orientalism exposes what Islam is not, John Esposito's work essentially showcases what Islam really is. And the acceptance his work found in the Muslim world amongst scholars as well as lay people is an indication of the authenticity of the knowledge that he has produced for 5 decades. He is at the moment a distinguished professor at Georgetown University, and I must also share that he was my mentor on my dissertation committee, has been a friend and supporter all these years. So I'm absolutely delighted to have with me Dr. John Esposito. John, mashallah, you have had a very long career. If I remember correctly, you've been a professor since 1977. I probably was in seventh grade at that time. So you're catching up with Emperor Akbar in, in the duration of reigning as a
Actually,
monarch of Islam.
it was 1967.
Oh,
Yes.
so you've been there
I'm
for
even older than you think. Yeah.
for nearly 5 decades of academic work. So in these 5 years, 5 decades that you have witnessed the study of religion and study of Islam in the West in particular, what do you think are the major changes, if any, that have taken place in the last 50 years?
Well, I mean, to begin with, it's hard to believe now, but in fact, the study of Islam in the, let's say, 60s, late 60s, early 70s, um, was leading to a dead end. No one could believe when I decided to move from being a young Catholic theologian to wanting to study Islam, because they all said you'll never get a job. And I can remember applying for jobs one year, and there was only one job open in the country. I mean, people forget that, for example, the people that did Islamic studies in the old days, many of them came out of history departments. I think Temple was the only religion department, or the first religion department, to offer a PhD in Islamic studies. So the field itself, Islam was not, as today, seen taught in across the educational spectrum. Islam was not part of the American Academy of Religion. The largest professional association of scholars of religion did not have a permanent section for Islam. We had to work on that in from about the mid 70s, and it was finally approved in the, I believe it was around 1984. The Middle East Studies Association had very few panels that really dealt with Islam. I mean, because for many people in the field, whether they were historians or social scientists, there was very much the sense that um, that modernization and development meant the marginalization of religion and its insignificance in terms of other than as a personal faith, and that had a tremendous effect, and also until the 1970s 80s, um, America was very much as one social scientist said in a study at the time, um, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And he was writing that to emphasize the Catholics had finally arrived as a major religion. Even though there were Muslims here, and there were certainly people of other faiths as well, they were identified more in terms of their nationality, not their religion. And you did not have on the horizon many mosques or temples, that were significantly visible. So it's changed dramatically when you look at a field today.
One of the developments that I have witnessed in my short career of 20 years is the emergence of a lot of Muslim scholars And there are two kinds of Muslim scholars, those who are immigrant scholars, those who have come here for higher education, and then those who were actually born and brought up here and
Mm.
who are uh, American Muslims and who are now studying. Do you think that they are having any kind of impact on the direction of Islamic studies, positive, negative, or otherwise?
Yeah, I think they are. I think again, people forget. In my time, it was not uncommon for, let's say, a Muslim with a PhD, that is, somebody who came from a Muslim country with a PhD, to feel that they had no opportunity to even contend to be elected. And there were one or two who were, well known and wrote, but did not get any kind of significant job. Ismail al-Faruqi was a very rare person. Fazlur Rahman at the University of Chicago. These were very, very rare personalities. And even in hiring, I can remember only a few decades ago, Muslim social scientist that I knew, very bright, etc. But I know in a couple of instances he had problems uh, getting a job in a political science department. And comments would be made. There'd be ways in which they were interviewed or not. Today we have a significant number of Muslims, either from overseas, but many who are born here, who are in the academy, who are among the many who participated at the American Academy of Religion, for example. And I know around the time that we hired Jonathan Brown, that time when we hired him, the three finalists we had were Muslims. And I mean, it showed that there was this shift taking place. I mean, it was an open-ended look. We were not privileging anybody's religious background, etc. But the three candidates that emerged were Muslims, and we see that more and more. When you look at many of the major universities now, from Harvard to the University of Chicago to the West Coast, there are Muslim scholars who are early level, mid level, and some in senior level. So again, it's a totally different world.
I remember when I was a grad student at Georgetown, I met a Muslim community member from Hyderabad. And he asked me 4 times that I was actually doing a PhD at Georgetown with scholarship. And then at the end of that fourth time, he says, wow, then you should probably get a job at a community college, definitely. I was horrified when he said that. I said, what do you mean? And he said, no, 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 Muslims don't generally, make it big in the academia here, especially in the Islamic studies. I said, have you heard of Majid Qaduri, who I was reading at that time? And I said,
Yes.
well, he's my role model and maybe I will make it too.
Yeah.
Uh, there is also this interesting development where we see in Islamic studies these cultural wars that are happening in America at large, now entering cultural wars. And you see young American scholars going after each other on issues of the importance of critical race theory or the place of feminism in Islamic studies or the impact of post-structural methods on, say, Quranic studies, assumptions that the Quran or maybe Islamic studies itself is either privileging certain class of people or gender and so on. So these battles that are taking place, how do you see them? I mean, these were not something that happened when you were president either of American Academy of Religion or of MESA, but how do you see, where do you see this trend going in the future?
Well, it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in the sense that, again, and it's not to say that sometimes there aren't times when uh, some Muslim scholars will feel that they don't get quite the representation that others have. But that's, if you actually look at the number of panels that occur at the American Academy of Religion, they're very diverse. And when you see some of the issues, it's not as you might have thought in the old days. Well, gee, if it's an issue with regard to, let's say, women in Islam, that the scholars who were talking about and emphasizing a kind of critique of reform would be somehow the Western scholars, But in fact, you have hot contestations, not just discussions, that will often occur among Muslim scholars as well, and across genders. So that's what I mean by the size now of the numbers of people we have really make make a significant difference. I mean, when I think back to the fact that it wasn't until 1986 I was elected president of Mesa. That was the first time that anybody who worked in Islamic studies. And then about 8 years ago, I was elected to the presidency of the American Academy of Religion. I mean, there was a long lag time. But I think in terms of where we are now, any look at the AAR sessions, I mean, the number of them, in the old days, again, you had no trouble going to you had a few sessions that you could go to, with a few scholars. That's not the case now. I can remember going to the AAR and reading a paper at a panel and being in a panic as a young academic that anybody from the College of the Holy Cross, which was where I was teaching, would come, because I figured they'd see maybe 6 to 8 people in the room, and maybe 4 of them would walk out before it were over. And I was on a panel with Wilford Campbell Smith, or who were top people in the field, but that wasn't what was being pulled in those meetings. It's a totally different situation now.
I spent many years ago, I spent some time at IKIM in Istanbul, the Islamic Center on the Asian side. And they have a very beautiful library in it. And I used to spend most of my time in the library, and I started a conversation about Fazlur Rahman with a librarian. And he said, let me show you something. We have a whole section on him. So they had a separate section just on Fazlur Rahman. And I was stunned to learn, and this is more than 10 years ago, that there were more than 400 dissertations done on Fazlur Rahman's work just in Turkey alone. And I found that he's similarly popular, not just in Pakistan, but also in Indonesia and Malaysia. But do you see contemporary?
Malaysia, by the way, has his library.
Who?
Malaysia.
Yes, Malaysia has
Fazlur Rahman's library, yeah.
So my question to you is that the new breed of Islamic studies scholars that are emerging, are they the kind for whom this is just a career, which will get them appropriate fellowships, designations, and great jobs? Or are they also at the same caliber that maybe Fazlur Rahman was in terms of being transformative or thinking about Islam, or to use the word loosely, reformist in their approach? Do you see that kind of scholarship coming out of the next generation of Muslim scholars who study Islam in the West?
Yeah, I think it varies. I think that there are some who this is simply a profession, and they may be working on topics that are not that are important, but they're deep historical, topics that they are focused, let's say, in the 10th century, and that's where they're going to be for the rest of their career. But when you actually look at the scholarship that's coming out, I mean, I have a series with Oxford on religion and global affairs, and I've had a number of rising stars, and some are stars now, who are Muslim in background. Some of them aren't, but many of them are, and are dealing with reform issues that have to do, for example, with the role of women in Islam and in Muslim society, issues that have to do with the question of slavery. My colleague Jonathan Brown has written on that topic, and a variety of other topics. So there's a good deal of a kind of reformist concern, and I think it grows out of probably that they may be people who are just interested in the modern period or the contemporary period, but also those that are primarily focused as scholars, but for whom their scholarship's important because for them it also dovetails with their faith and how they see their faith and how they would like to see the future of their faith. I remember being very struck. It might have been 20 years ago now, but I was at a wedding in Toronto, and it was a Muslim wedding, and Gene and I think, were the only non-Muslims there. And at the table was somebody, a fellow who was talking about the fact that his father had created a mosque, and he had also worked with and helped create it, but that he was going to have to probably move to another mosque. And I asked why. And he said, because there had been an influx of many from overseas who were very conservative. And he realized that he'd probably have to move because his 2 sons, who were in their 20s, finally came home one day after Jummah prayer, at the mosque, and said, we can't keep going back there and listening to that kind of sermon. It's not dealing with, our world, etc. How much more so even today, because we have an incredible number, in contrast to some other countries, incredible number of American Muslims who've moved up in the educational side of things, both men and women at the same level. And many of them go off and become lawyers, etc. But others, you have a large generation that actually are involved, whether it's through Islamic studies or through their concerns about human rights, concerned with these issues, but also with these issues as issues of faith.
I mean, I do notice that, especially on the issue of gender and women's studies, there is a lot more attention being paid to scholars in the West, partly because they have the freedom and the resources to do this work. Julianne Hammer's recent book on domestic violence and even Amina Wadud's work is getting a lot of attention, especially in other parts of the world. But I want to now come back to how Islam is being broadly understood. There's this constant joke that wars is God's way of teaching Americans about geography, right? We learn about a country after we invade it. So there is a lot of geopolitical justifications and reasons behind the study of Islam also in the West. So, but what are the issues? Like what was America fascinated with in the 1980s, and what is it thinking about now when we think about Islam?
Well, let me begin by saying that I can remember a time when the very fact that I studied Islam and spoke on it, and I would go to Muslim countries, the first thing that people would ask me, even if they liked what I said, it would be, mashallah, but why aren't you a Muslim? And why did you study? And I remember in Pakistan having a newspaper fellow who wanted to interview me, and he commented on my beard. As you know, I had a beard for about 20, 25 years. And he said, it was clear that the CIA had taught me how to trim my beard so that I would fit in Pakistan. But I think that what we have seen is the incredible, I see as the incredible impact that 9/11 had. When I was recruited to go to Georgetown, which would have been, I think I went there in 1993, and to create the center, there weren't many centers. The question was a center needed? And the only other major center that I knew of was Hartford Seminary, and they dealt more primarily with theological, theology. There was an open field, and you could do lots of things and accomplish a lot of things. People wanted knowledge. Yes, they had stereotypes, but it was something like 9/11 that drove home this sense of an Islamic threat, And as you would know, I wrote a book at the beginning and mid 1990s called The Islamic Threat, Myth, or Reality, because at that time, when I looked at the first Gulf War and other occasions that were taking place, I could see on the horizon. And as you began to look at some newspaper pieces in Europe and America, although most people didn't really notice it, but you were beginning to see Islam being seen as a problem, not just some militant expression, that there must be something about this religion. And that took off after 9/11. Now, what did it mean? In a weird kind of way, it goes back to something you said earlier. It was, as it were, wonderful for the explosion in the field in terms of availability of jobs, consulting, media interviews, etc. It's hard to even describe. I had forgotten about it, and now that I'm writing this memoir for Oxford, which is making my hair get even grayer than it is now, I begin to realize just how busy we were. I mean, we could be doing media interviews for hours each day, and the enrollments at Georgetown, not only in Islam itself, but in the Middle East and the Arab world, and in the language of Arabic. Every fall for a number of years, even though they planned really well, the department that taught Arabic language and literature, particularly language, had to hire even more people as adjuncts than they projected. Now, that meant that you had this incredible coverage, more people asking questions, and you could therefore publish far more books. Again, I would just go back and say historically, when I sent out a book prospectus to publishers, there'd be no answer initially, or you get great idea but no audience. The Iranian Revolution, changed that significantly, but 9/11 raised it to an even greater magnitude. But it really was, again, the Iranian Revolution makes it much more relevant. The field grows, but somebody from outside would be saying, yeah, but what are the reasons for that? Well, the primary reason on the part of government and even in education would be that people wanted to study about this phenomenon, which they framed in a negative way. But what it did is open up the field and open up all kinds of possibilities for jobs and publishing, et cetera. I remember within 6 weeks after the revolution, I think I signed 3 book contracts, my first 3 book contracts. And before that, you'd hear nothing, So it's just been phenomenal. But 9/11 then juiced it up. And then depending on where you were in Europe or in America, 2010, the so-called mosque at ground zero, which was neither a mosque nor a ground zero, but to the extent that really had the Islamophobes coming in, and then the explosion in social media, all of that has had both a negative, a very negative, as well as a very positive side when it comes to the field of Islamic studies, the Middle East, etc.
Right now, I see there seems to be 2 different streams in people who study Islam, not just in the West, but everywhere nowadays, whether it is in the religion department or even in social sciences. One is the study of Islam as a threat even today, so security issues. So securitization of Islam is now the main large. And then those who are studying Islamophobia. So you have this two trends. So in a way, it kind of is a reflection of how the Middle East and the East was approached before Edward Said's Orientalism came out and after his Orientalism came. But now we see that there are significant developments in the world. The climate crisis is becoming to be obvious, so much so that you have snowfall in Texas. People they haven't awoken to the fact that there is still, climate change happening. It's time they did. But there are other things like the pandemic, etc., which are becoming more important than the so-called Islamic threat. So what are the issues that will now animate the academy? What would people be studying now if Islam and Islamic threat are not the most important things coming out from the Muslim world?
Well, I think that it's a really good question. I think that, to put it in the broader context, remember that in recent years, we've seen really the rise of, if you will, the sciences and the social sciences, in terms of interest of students, and the humanities have begun to trail, and you do see that, and I would say the same thing is true in terms of, in general, enrollments in the field of religion as well as Islamic studies. I remember dealing with someone at a very senior level in the Society for Biblical Literature. And the fellow was telling me, and he was not even teaching at a seminary, he was teaching at a state university, but the incredible drop of students who were studying, religion. The other side of it too is that, at a school like Georgetown, we're very vibrant in all the areas, but security studies remains probably the strongest in terms of enrollments, and then others follow from that. Certainly, I think there still is a great interest in international affairs, and that will then feed into it. Georgetown has, in the last few years, very often come in as first in the nation, and at times first probably in the world, depending on what program in the School of Foreign Service you're looking at. So I think the international affairs side is there. but there is a question. For example, there are still jobs that are out there for people in the field of religion, in all the religions and in Islamic studies, but not what we had before. And so, in fact, I remember when I was president of the AAR, and that might have been 6 or 8 years ago, we had a special panel for graduate students, and part of the reason was to see how are they perceiving their future. And some of us wanted to tell them they ought to be taken seriously. They ought to be thinking seriously about what that future might look like. And I remember after different faculty being concerned that the people really reflect on this, you had one of the leaders of the grad students said, gee, I've been talking to the grad students and they don't care about that question. I mean, many of them are really into what they're doing, and they either have faith that there'll be a job out there when they get there, or they just don't want to think about it now. And I think that this kind of issue, will become more of a concern. I think that people will more and more see a leveling off, for example, clearly of the kind of enrollments that we had in the first 10 years after 9/11, first 10 years or more.
Whether academics have jobs or not, Muslims will be Muslims.
That's right.
So what do you think are the main issues that Muslims will be grappling with in the next 10 years, 15 years? So for thinking Muslims, for Muslims who are decision makers in their countries, what are the challenges that they are facing going forward?
Yeah, I think, let me say that I come at this with naturally my own experience, but the fact that when I went into the field and when I got my degree, I was very conscious of the fact that people didn't know about Islam. And even at the time of bin Laden, I was asked by Oxford to write a book on the emergence of Al-Qaeda and also militancy. But about halfway through it, my wife said, you really have to do a Q&A, what everyone needs to know about Islam. And I said, why? She said, because all you've been doing for a decade is complaining that whether you deal with policymakers or you deal with the average media person, they don't understand that, okay? And the other issue was Palestine and Israel. And I knew, the hubris of youth probably, I knew in my bones that in my lifetime, that situation would be resolved. In fact, I remember thinking to myself at the time, those poor, and I won't use the next word that I would have used, a little bit of an expletive, those academics who spent their whole life working on Palestine and Israel were like academics who spend their whole life trying to cure a disease, and at the end of their career, it's not happened, So, I look now and, where are we? Not only on Palestine and Israel, and we can talk about that after, but when we look at the nature of what's going on in the Muslim world, in so many countries in the Middle East and into South Asia, we see a robust authoritarianism. The response to the Arab Spring, really struck fear in the hearts of so many of the authoritarian rulers, and particularly the governments of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that brought a whole new role that they played, both in the coup in Egypt, but also post that period. And then many of the regimes in the area being really concerned about democracy, et cetera. And so you could have a lot of outward looking reforms as is going on with MBS in Saudi Arabia in some ways. But the fact is, it's actually under an incredibly authoritarian regime. Well, so I think that the whole issue of democracy and human rights is important. When I worked with Gallup as an advisor, and even more recently in a major study that was done in the Muslim world, one saw that a significant number of people, in one of the studies, 75%, still want to see greater democratization, and even a significant percentage don't really think that the Arab Spring was a total failure. They look at uprisings that have occurred in the recent past in Sudan and in other countries, and they see it as setting an example potentially for the future. I think that there's also then a position there that has to do with, if you will, relations between the West, or here, let's say the US and Europe, and the Muslim world. And the irony is, if you look at the US and Europe, on two different fronts, there's an issue. One, when it comes to Islamophobia, because of the growth in countries that see themselves believing in diversity and pluralism. You would never think that would be the case. And then you would even see countries like France that have always thought that they're the most educated in the world, proving where they really stand more recently, and Austria, these incredible kind of swing. So for the relations between the Muslim world and the West, and also with regard to Muslims in the West, this issue of really moving to a point where we understand each other better politically, religiously, and culturally, and actually realize that at the heart of a good deal of this is major problems with identity. So you see, issues of white nationalism, and you have versions of this also in the Muslim world, where people in one part of the Muslim world look upon people in the other part of the Muslim world, from on high or even within countries. And I think the issues of diversity and human rights are as strong as you could want. If you look at Freedom House and its studies in the last 10 years, after seeing and people saying, is there a fourth democratic wave coming? It's gotten worse and worse. And what was interesting was during the Trump period, you had Freedom House, the leader of it, writing a separate piece saying that for the first time, pointing out that America's image in the Middle East had really taken a hit, and one of the reasons was that we had a president who was more happy dealing with the rulers of North Korea and China and the Philippines, et cetera. So this is a really big issue. I think we're between a rock and a hard place in terms of where we're going to go with the future. The division that exists, for example, in the United States now, but also in sections of Europe, where you have forms of white nationalism and supremacism, those divisions have deep roots. Now, some people may be pulled off that, but what we've seen in our own politics is that even people who know better, many of the moderate Republicans, can't break from going with Trump and Trump-like folks.
Last year I was talking to an Egyptian intellectual, and they are very funny. Their sense of humor is very interesting. So one of them remarked to me that, why do you keep promoting democracy, Muqtedar? You go through all of these fancy primaries and debates and all of these billions of dollars spent on election, and you end up with Donald Trump, and then we do nothing and we end up with CC. What's the difference? Was his question, right? Like, what's the point of democracy? But from a serious perspective, we do see that there is a retreat of democracy taking place. The US is not a full democracy anymore by the same indices. The democracy index places the US as a flawed democracy. So things are getting worse in the sense that there are fewer democracies today in the world than there were 15 years ago.
Exactly.
And the quality of democracies, which are democratic, has also declined. Even Japan is a flawed democracy now. So while there is a global trend which is pushing democracy, or there is a retreat of democracy globally, what hope can there be for democracy to emerge in the Middle East, where it is absent at the moment?
I think long term that there is hope, simply because I remember before the Arab Spring, right when Mubarak fell, and I remember being in Cairo and having a young man, let's say mid-20s to late 20s, well-educated kind of journalist, and he sort of took out a set of pictures and he pointed to me and said, here is Mubarak and here are all the American presidents that passed along, and Mubarak was still there. Okay. And I think, what we lost sight of and what did come out with what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt and other countries, was a real desire for a significant number of the population, and particularly it's exacerbated today by the fact that countries are more and more consisting of large numbers of youth. So you've got a youth explosion that continues to be the case. For many of those youth, with the internet, which then enables them to understand the world better and what's out there, and also have a better sense of where they are, okay? and what their expectations are. I think that change will come. I think that the uprisings that have taken place in the last few years, at times, popular uprisings in Sudan or Iran, etc., or just as even as happening now in Myanmar in terms of youth. I think that there's that desire will be there, and the question will be when does it come? And I think that's going to be dependent on a variety of factors, but one certainly is the nature of the kind of governments that they have and will continue to have, and the other is the nature of the international community and its role. And it's a sad day when you have a coup in Egypt and a president like Barack Obama could not say that a coup is a coup is a coup. I mean, that really, or when you have in the Guantanamo case, and people should go to bridge.georgetown.edu and see on our Bridge website, we have 4 major entries on the history of Guantanamo, the people that were there, where did they come from, what happened to them, etc. And you realize that somebody like Mohammed Salahi, who finally was able to get out, the Salahi was arrested as a very young man, held for 7 or 8 years, tortured in 3 different countries, no hard evidence ever brought against him. Finally, a conservative military judge basically said, even the circumstantial evidence doesn't hold. Next thing you know, the Obama administration decided to appeal it. And so he wound up for another 7 years waiting for that liberation. So I think that that's where the side of, if you will, Western countries and developing countries becomes important. And I think what threatens it is that even in countries like Northern Europe that can be so enlightened in so many other ways, and where you don't have that many Muslims, you can have strong Islamophobia.
I think there's a movie coming out this week about him, the Guantanamo, Muhammad Salahi.
Yes, it comes out this week.
Yeah, with Jodie Foster acting as his lawyer.
Yes.
So she's. I saw her talking about this case, and she's doing a pretty good job of highlighting the tragedy of Guantanamo more than just promoting the movie. When we talked about for decades, when there was this discussion about whether Islam and democracy are compatible and when will democracy arrive in the Muslim world, there were a lot of academics and scholars and experts who felt that one of the vehicles for democratization of the Muslim world would have been the emergence of political Islam, especially the Ikhwan al-Muslimin and their efforts. And what political Islam was essentially doing was demanding the democratization of the Middle East. And if you were at this time, 10 years ago, that sentiment was at its peak, right? It just happened and Egypt happening. But what do you see now, the future of the political Islam, and even Muslim countries are now labeling some of these movements as terrorist organizations, and the geopolitical orientation in the Muslim world is changing just to counter Ikhwan rather than other potential enemies that they had in the past.
Well, I think the great irony is to show you that the fears that countries that are actually, that we would see as quite strong as authoritarian regimes, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the extent to which they felt so threatened was that they got involved a year before the coup and bankrolled it after the country. But then also that they moved, both countries, but particularly NBZ, moved to create a list of terrorist organizations. And they try to put everybody and their mother and father on it. I mean, in terms of movements. So much so that when they sent it to the UK and to the US, and certainly in the US situation, Barack Obama, after a week or two, basically publicly said, I've looked at some of the organizations that you're talking about here, and this is not a threat. But what they really wanted to do was to really totally demonize the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as this significant force, not only in Egypt, but the fact is that it had many offspring, across much of the world. So I think that challenge is there for those movements. And I think for those movements, the challenge is whether or not they themselves can go through processes of reform. At the same time, in many of the countries, they're going to be certainly with the authoritarian regimes in the Muslim world, but also in some Western countries, there are going to be problems, not just with the extremists and terrorists who we need to be concerned about, but with more mainstream, like the Muslim Brotherhood. And the fear can be so misguided if we're not careful that we suddenly realize in our country, you now have Homeland Security and the FBI saying, what's the number one threat to the United States? The number one threat to the United States of white supremacists and nationalists, militant.
Yes, I think that is going to put the discussion of Islamism and its potential threat on the back burner. But that is I think, for US and probably US alone. But for example, with what's going on in France right now, if you look at the politics of Saudi Arabia and Egypt and UAE, all of these countries are focused on political Islam, and even Pakistan is in the mix with all kinds of Islamic groups acting there. But the traditional question which we would ask about compatibility of religion with the times, with modernity and post-modernity, etc., those issues are still out there. It's not just about democracy, the issues of gender, the issues of alternate lifestyles, human rights, etc. On top of that, now Muslim minorities suffering in China with the Uyghur issue and the Kashmir. Yes. So do you see any silver lining? I mean, I don't want to end this conversation talking about potential.
It reminds me of years ago, I was speaking at the University of Wisconsin, and they turned out a nice audience, which was great for them to do that. And all of a sudden, I wasn't even conscious of it. I stopped talking, and there was this and then I could hear people sort of mumbling, like they were worried about maybe there was something wrong with me. And I said, for the first time in my life, I'm giving a talk. And as I'm talking to you, I also can think ahead, if you're an accomplished speaker. And I'm suddenly realizing, oh my God, how do I come up with an ending? Where is there light at the end of the tunnel? I don't see any light. And the classic joke in recent years has been, if you're looking for light at the end of the tunnel, the chances are, if you do see the light, it's an oncoming train. I think that we're in a very major transitional period now, where it's kind of ironic, on any given day, if you look at the news, you get up and you can be responding to, for those of us that deal internationally, with what's going on across the world. And as you said, it's not just in the Middle East, it's in China with minorities, it's Kashmir, it's in India where you have, Hindus and Christians, where you have Muslims and Christians having to deal with some of the militant, Hindus. I think that at the same time, this is what complicates it. At the same time, how much confidence can we have in American and European, some of them, governments? Now we've moved to a Biden administration, but during the Trump period, okay, how much confidence could we have that the United States would not make things worse rather than better? You look at France; it's unbelievable that Macron is doing what he's doing, and in Austria, in which they are actually moving against mainstream Muslims. They use phrases like political Islam, that's their enemy, and they're going to have an international conference that they're going to co-sponsor, on political Islam. But in fact, if you look at the raids that have taken place in Austria and the raids that have taken place in France, and the statements that are being made, mainstream Muslims and mainstream Muslim practice and belief is being seen as extremist, and that doesn't make for light at the end of the tunnel. I think what it does do is we have a choice. We can either energize ourselves and rise to the occasion, or not. And I do see where I see a hope is that certainly as I look at the United States, for example, in my experience in education, or when I go to a fair number of other countries, including very much in the Muslim world, you have a younger generation that's much better educated, and that if you actually did, polling, you would see where they're coming down, and a significant percentage of these folks, of these young people, are people who are concerned about the world that they're living in. You see it in the sense that they're so much ahead of their elders when it comes to things like climate control, et cetera, and I think that that's where the hope comes. It comes from the newer generations, the young generations of scholars that are out there, and it also comes from some of the older generation of scholars. But I think in terms of the hope, it's a new generation of younger people that, whether it's in the UK or France or here, will take on their government when they see the government acting, violating the human rights of anybody in their country, including Muslims, Jews, etc. Because there's a great uptick, of anti-Semitism along with Islamophobia, and just that raw white nationalism and supremacism. You look at groups like QAnon and whatnot, and I've known situations where you can actually go into a professional, I can't name the places because I go to some of them, but you can go into a business or into a medical situation building, and you can be in a waiting room and see not just Fox, but even a QAnon type channel on. And you know what I mean? You're not in the underground, as it were, when you're seeing that. And you look at the polls that come out now, or even the election, what happened here, the number of Americans, so overwhelming, that voted for Trump, and the opinions that they continue to hold. And I think that's also true, as I said, in countries that we wouldn't have expected it of in Europe, and in Northern Europe in particular.
A few years ago, I spoke at an event in Kuala Lumpur a week after you had been there. And I remember while I was checking in at the hotel, I looked around, and in the lobby, I saw this huge, like 10 feet tall poster of you. And I thought, wow, is there a rock concert or what? And I remember you telling me when I was a student in college that the thing that you loved about the Muslim world was that they treated you like a rock star. And I,
Yeah.
for about 4 decades or more, you have been like a rock star of Islamic studies. And I'm extremely grateful that you have, over the years, helped mentor me, and also for talking to me today. And I hope that listeners will benefit, and also go and buy some of your books and benefit from them, also use them in their classes for those who are colleagues from the academy. So thank you very much, John, for talking to me today.
Thank you. You're one of my best former students.
Thank you. So now that I have on record